And welcome everybody to this edition of Communications and Cigars. I'm your host, John Crook, and today's episode is going to be entitled, Let's Talk About Tones, Baby, also known as signaling. Yes, I did listen to a lot of Salt and Peppa in the 90s, so I do apologize for that. So, what is tonight's episode about? Well, tonight's episode is actually a viewer recommendation, and the recommendation came in and said, hey, John, you know what? A lot of radios have signaling features on there, but I want to know a little bit more about signaling features, and not necessarily just signaling features of like what you may have like on a standard radio, kind of like maybe like, you know, Ctcss or PL and those kind of things like that, but maybe a little bit more into some of the other signaling modes and methods and stuff that are out there, so that maybe businesses use, that public safety uses, that amateur uses, GMRS, all those things like that. So I thought, you know what, that is a great topic and episode for tonight. And thus tonight's episode, let's talk about Tones, baby. But first of all, welcome to Communications and Cigars. I want to thank everybody that does tune in, I can't even talk tonight, does turn in, how do I say it? Subscribes, however you want to call it, to our show on a weekly basis. Of course, we meet here every Monday night at 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. on the East Coast, 7 p.m. Mountain, or 6 p.m. on the West Coast there. And we talk about communications, as well as we touch a little bit on cigars or enjoy a cigar. But of course, it is the winter time, and if anybody is familiar with the upper Midwest, you will know that sometimes the weather is not very friendly for going ahead and being able to do these episodes in a place where we can enjoy a cigar and talk about communications. So that's why we are from Studio B here again tonight, where it is the basement, and I'm not going to smoke in the house here or anything like that on there. Don't have the ventilation, don't want to go ahead and risk anything like that. So instead of enjoying a cigar while doing the show, we'll talk quickly about it. So for tonight's cigar, I actually kind of went with something a little bit different, and these are Irish creams. Now, Irish creams is it's a Blast Cafe coffee, and what these are is sometimes known as kind of like cigarros. Or it comes, some people have tiny little things. I've heard them called a bunch of different things, but basically they are a little tiny cigarro like that on there. A lot of people said, like I've never heard of them or stuff when I bring it up. And I said, go back, look at some of the Clint Eastwood movies, the Old West movies that he did. He had that little cigar kind of hanging out of his mouth there. They are still cigars. They're not a cigarette in any way, shape, or form. And kind of what's kind of nice about these, to be perfectly honest with you, is if you do want to have and enjoy kind of the flavor, the leafy product of a cigar, but you don't have time to smoke a big cigar, maybe time constraints, whatever the case may be, or a lot of times this will happen in the wintertime, where I do not have a chance to sit outside or be outside for a long time, I can easily take one of these. Now, once again, the ones I picked here tonight are Irish Cream. It is a Blast Cafe coffee flavor on there. So they make a couple different ones. They do have like a mocha flavor one. This is a coffee flavor one. They do have a vanilla flavor one. So there are a couple different ones out there if you want something that has a little bit of a palate or palatable taste to it. And they're quite delicious. I kind of like them too. Like I said, really nice when I do a lot of traveling and stuff. Sometimes I can't take my nice big cigars, nor do I really want to take my nice big cigars with me, because maybe my portable humidor isn't set up yet, whatever the case may be. These are nice and easy. You can just kind of fit them in. I can fit them into like a little plastic bag with a little silica packet in there to keep it dry, or I shouldn't say silica packet, but there's little like moisture packets you can buy on there to keep your cigars at that, optimum temperature and more so optimum humidity on there. So that's the cigars portion of Communications and Cigars tonight. So let's dive into the core of things. Oh, let me do this one more quick thing here. If you do have any ideas or want to go ahead and make a comment or a suggestion about the show, please feel free to email me. And emails should be right up here. It's communications-cigars@jjkcom.com. Once again, communications-cigars@jjkcom.com. Don't be afraid to email me with any thoughts, comments, ideas, topics you want to see on the show on there. More than happy to respond back, get that viewer mail in there also, too. You want to be aware of when our next upcoming shows are going to be. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, do so. You'll get a notification when the episodes are going to take place. We try to get them out about a week in advance. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work on there. But subscribe to our channel and you'll do that. And Communications and Cigars is, of course, sponsored by JJK Communications. They've helped us out here a lot with being able to get some of the equipment to do some of the things that normally a person maybe wouldn't be able to do out of their pocket. So it is nice that JJK Communications can and does help sponsor Communications and Cigars. Alrighty, so let's dive into tonight's topic at hand. So tonight's topic at hand is going to deal with signaling. And when I say signaling, I'm not just talking about the general little, like I said, audible signaling. So tonight we're going to cover PL tones, also known as Ctcss, Dpl tones, also known as DCS. We're going to talk about Dtmf tones on there. We're also going to dig into MDC 1200. We're going to talk about G-Star, Fleet Sync, Modat, and tone paging. And that's going to kind of wrap up today's show because that's a lot of the common kind of signalings on there, or signaling you may actually hear or monitor on scanners. Now, there's a ton of signaling out there. And if you want to hear what a lot of these signaling tones and different tones and stuff are out there, just go do a computer search, Google search, whatever search on there. There's a couple different pages that do exist out there where you can actually hear audio clips of what the actual tones sound like on there. So actually like the data bursts and all that kind of jazz on there. So by all means, go check that out on there. Another thing I would go ahead and do is don't be afraid if you want to learn a little bit more about tones, you want to learn a little bit more about signaling options and stuff like that, do a Google search on there. The company Midians, Midians, I believe it is. I don't work for Midians and not a dealer or sponsor or anything like that tied to them and everything like that. But I want to let you know they used to have a chart. Let's put it that way. It was a tone signaling chart and it gave you all the listings of the different tones that were out there. So really a great, fascinating thing. Showed some tone timings and stuff. Really, really great information out there. If they don't have it for download anymore, which I don't know if they do or don't, you probably can find a cached copy on the internet somewhere. But if it's a really, really cool thing, if you're into radios and stuff like that, like I am, that's what it is. When I used to work in the two-way radio field, I always had that tone signaling like chart. Like it's a chart, but it's kind of like a couple pages on there because it talks about everything from Ctcss tones to Dcs tones, or Dpl tones, I should say, PL tones, whatever you want to call it, Dtmf timing, paging tone timing, tone remote. So if you have tone remote timing, all these different numerous things that are out there, which are really, really helpful to have it, especially if you're in an MCOM situation, by all means. You definitely want to take a look, get this information, put it in a little book there for you. You never know when you're going to need it, especially, like I said, if you're in a deployable situation stuff. That used to be in my COM-L-COM-T AUXCOM kit. I used to have that information in there, and it's just so readily available. As a matter of fact, some of the screenshots I'm going to show you tonight are from that reference material on there. So just go ahead and do a search on the internet for it. So let's start out with the easiest. We're going to start easy, and then we're going to kind of go high or complex. And the first tone or stuff we're going to talk about for signaling is the Ctcss tone, or the PL tone, which is by far the, how do you want to say, the longest, most common standing type of sub-audible signaling that does exist out there. Now, there's an important thing to understand when it comes to Ctcss or PL tones. The term PL stands for private line. That's a Motorola coined phrase and term that they had when, excuse me, the whole point of the private line was for you not to have encrypted, not to have secure communications, but to have communications that, let's say I want to talk from myself to another user. And maybe we're on a shared frequency, or maybe we have our own frequency, but we don't want to get interference. We don't want to hear other traffic, whatever the case may be. That's where you would be able to use these filters in there called PL, private line, or what we'd sometimes know as Ctcss tones. Now, what it would do is it would PL or Ctcss tones inject a sub-audible, so below the audible level, auditory level of the human ear, which would range anywhere from 30 hertz to about 300 hertz. Because when you get about 300 hertz, people can start to hear tones. As a matter of fact, paging tones, which we'll talk about later, they go down to like the 300 hertz range area there. But what it is that it is a sine wave that's inserted into your audio waveform. So if you were to actually look at it on the monitor, if you could separate the two out, you would actually see two sine waves. You'd see your normal voice sine wave, and then you'd see the subaudible tone, not matching obviously your audio tone, because if it was matching it, then you would hear a tone itself, but just is going to be below or right near your audio carrier. And what that would do is when the receivers would hear a signal, they would not only be listening for audio, so getting that core sense, that active sense, but it would also be looking for that subaudible tone built in. When it saw the waveform of the subaudible tone frequency that it should be listening to, then the receiver would say, I have valid receiving parameters, so I have a signal and I have a tone, and it's the correct tone. It would then unmute your speaker or activate the receiver, depending on how it's set up in the audio circuitry of there. Now, the tones ranged from 30 hertz all the way up to about 300 hertz. In all reality, though, you have two groups of tones on there. You have the standard EIA European standard of 38 Ctcss or PL tones. They have 38 standard as part of the EIA standard, and that says all radios should at least have these 38 tones in there. Of course, the amateur radio community, guess what? We got to be different. We got to be better. So most amateur radio operators and stuff and manufacturers have come up with 50 tones, which is a combination of the standard 38 EIA tones, and then they add on an additional 12 tones. So that would bring it up to 50 tones. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, that means that some radios that are maybe sort of business or LMR related may not have the ability to use some of the tones that, let's say, amateur or some other radio-based manufacturer kind of radios might be able to use. This is not only, let's say, between different services. This is like amateur doesn't just have these 50 tones and then public safety, business, those radios don't have that. No. As a matter of fact, in some cases, you may even find out that if a radio maybe, say, is manufactured by a Japanese company versus, let's say, a Chinese company, or the different firmware for regions or stuff, they may have different tones. You may even now see on some radios that they actually have a user tone that you can select. So for an example, it will have a non-standard PL tone on there. Excuse me here, I've kind of got a dry throat today. But you're going to see some of those tones that may not be there. So you may have an odd tone in there, but you can adjust your radio to it. So some radios might be able to do that. Some radios may not be able to do that. Is there a real list or accuracy on that? No, there isn't really. But where did they come up with the standard of tones? Well, let's go back to crystal-controlled radios. And when you talk about crystal-controlled radios, there was no way to program a tone in there because they were crystal radios. You had your ICOM modules for transmit and receive, and then you had these sometimes referred to as permacode or permafilters, which then allowed you to transmit and receive these sub-audible tones on there. Now, with that being said, it's interesting on how they were set up. And what happened really was that they really were filters for tones. So what would happen is that with these filters, these permacode filters, or these little, like I said, they look like little flat, like almost weird flat chips that had pins that you slid into the radios. What would actually happen is that when that signal would come in, they were actually tiny little tuned bars, for sake of a better term. And when the proper Ctcss or PL tone would come in, that bar would usually, for sake of a better term, kind of become active. And then it would allow the receiver, it would then send a signal to the receiver saying, hey, wait a minute. Hey, guess what? Or I should say the speaker, hey, guess what? We're receiving a signal. We're seeing this. Now open up because we have both options that are being met there. So that's where that subaudible tone comes in. Now, there is a drawback to Ctcss, and the reason, and this is why we're going to get into some other modes on there. And one of the drawbacks to the Ctcss tone is that Ctcss tones can be falsed, okay? Or they can false activate. And what I mean by that is, think of this. So one of the common Ctcss tones is 100 hertz. Okay, so 100.0 hertz. And yes, it is actually hertz. It is a frequency measurement. It is below our audio level tone. Once again, human ear goes to about the lower 300 hertz, so it's below our tone. But if you think about it, if that signal is embedded into our waveform, it's actually mixing in a way with our audio that we have come out. Now, if a mix happens correctly, one of the next nearest tones excuse me, is 103.8 hertz. What could happen realistically is that even though you're on 100 hertz, your radio might be listening for 103.8. But by the mix of your audio, by the mix of the signal, by the mix of how analog RF works, that receiver may see, oh, wait a minute, hey, I see 100 hertz. Oh, wait a minute, there's a mix. Oh, wait, it looks like 103.8. And it can actually open up your receiver. And that's happened a lot. Public safety has had that happen. I've even heard it happen with even just radios that I have today, that it's an analog channel and there's skip coming in, or there's some sort of receive interference on the channel that you go by from like a gas station pump, from an electrical sign, whatever the case may be. And guess what happens? Even though you have your Ctcss or PLD code active on that radio, guess what? It mixes, it hears it, and the radio will open up real quickly. Now, with that also said, Ctcss is quite interesting because as you see here now, this is the subaudible tone. The Ctcss, to end that static crash, has what they call a reverse burst option. So your subaudible tone's going, you have your transmit audio and everything going there, but at the end, when you let up off of your PTT button and you're using Ctcss, it can, once again, depending on some radios that have this ability or not, will be listening for a reverse burst. And what we mean by a reverse burst is we mean that it's 180 degrees phased tone, so basically a complete opposite of the tone. In this case, what happens is that reverse burst will tell the receiver, okay, speaker, time to be quiet on there. And when that time to be quiet happens, that's why you'll hear sometimes nothing. Radios that do not have a reverse burst is sometimes when you'll hear, after a repeater on keys, you'll hear that, and that's that static crash of the signal ending on there. And kind of like if there's another signal close by or some other signal on there, depending on the radios you have, if they don't have this reverse burst option, you may hear another signal sneak in at the end. So another good case in point, a good example is on my ambulance service that I'm on. We have a frequency that sometimes when the band condition opens or the weather condition opens, there's another department far away on there. They are not using the same subaudible tone that we are. However, when we are listening and there is skip coming in, we may hear our dispatch center go ahead and talk to us and everything, and just as the repeater drops or the dispatch on keys or another unit on keys and I'm listening, I may hear a quick little blurb of there. So it'll be like, copy time is 21:19, copy 429, and you hear that little burp on there from that other signal, because at that time that Ctcss is setting that reverse burst to be quiet, to mellow down. So when it does that, that's where you can get that little bit of like a static crash if you don't have it on there, and why you can sometimes hear that maybe some other traffic on the frequency. I hope that makes sense there. And Ctcss is good. Don't get me wrong. It's not saying that it's bad or anything like that, but it's important to understand that kind of falsing does and can take place. Now, with the advancements of PL tones, people are saying, okay, wait a minute, I only have 30 APL tones. I maybe need more. And that's where they came up with DCS or Dpl tones. So DCS is digital coded squelch or digital private line. This does not mean it's actual digital voice. So don't get confused. Just because you see or hear the word digital in there does not mean that it's actually digital. In this case, what's happening is instead of looking at a sine wave embedded in your signal, they're going to be looking at a square wave. Your radios are going to be looking at a square waveform with either upward or downward reflection from the baseline of the frequency. And what I mean by that is take a look at this graph here. As you see, we have the frequency in the center as sort of a baseline. Now what you see happening is you see positive reflections up from the frequency or negative reflections from the frequency. So if it's a positive reflection from the frequency, you'll see that the receiver in that embedded would be the example of a 1 or an on, and then you would see that the negative reflections would be a 0. And what's going to happen is when you're using DCS and or DPL, you're going to find that it's more rigid, is the best way to say it, for access. Some people, and I've seen it myself, where sometimes when you use a DCS tone, you may take almost like a half a second for the receiver to actually key up on or activate because it's taking a moment to decode that DCS code. That's normal. And because you're not going to have falsing. If you do not have the right DCS code, so the DCS code example on here is 023. That's kind of the standard. That's kind of the low end of it, right? The next one I believe up is 025. If I have 025 and you have a radio that is 023 and we're on the same frequency, that is not going to open whatsoever because the receiver is not receiving the ones and the zeros for 023. The receiver is saying, I'm seeing codes for 025. Kind of is an interesting thing on that too. If you were to ever hear, and sometimes people may hear it, people who are using Ctcss tones and they double with one another, so two people are keying up at the same time, you'll usually hear it like they're both fighting for the signal at the same time. Kind of sort of like you're receiving two radio stations at once. However, when you are hearing or seeing, or with monitoring, I should say, two people who are keying up at the same time using DCS, you actually will sometimes hear like a fluttering noise because it's that actual embedded signal in there of ones and zeros that the receiver is trying to filter out on there. So that's kind of the interesting part about DCS. DCS tends to be more specific. It tends to be more, I don't want to say secure because that's not right, but more has less of a likelihood to false out as compared to running a Ctcss tone. Now, one other interesting part about DCS or DPL tones is you have 104 DCS tones. That's pretty standard across the board, whether it's amateur or whether it's public safety, business radios, whatever. You have 104 standard tones. But in all reality, it's interesting because they have normal and inverted DCS tones. Now, a lot of people think when they're going through their radios, they may see it in their programming. Some may say like 023N or 023I. Some may see it just as 023, and then someone may go ahead and see 023I. There's a couple different ways, depending on the manufacturer, on how it's noted in the radio or how you select it. Understand this. Because of the way DCS is designed, your inverted tone is actually, or I should say your inverted Dpl code is actually going to also be a same code. Follow me on this one. I know it's kind of difficult, but it's going to be a same code of another tone. And what I mean by that is I'm saying is that, hey, guess what? Here, we're going and looking, we're trying to get a tone here. We got, let's say, DCS tone of 023. Well, with the 104 tones, it's only going to be able to have X amount of reversal on one another. So, and I'm pulling on my list here too, just right away here. So for an example, the inverted codes and the inverted tones are going to be kind of opposite of one another. by just selecting it. So it's basically looking at, I'm trying to think of a good way to explain it, is looking at it as it's another set of ones and zeros, but because you're inverting it, that set of ones and zeros are also going to be another set of ones and zeros for a different tone. You can only have so many ones and zeros on there. I guess that's the biggest thing that people need to kind of understand, and sometimes people don't look at it that way or understand it. So for example, DCS code 023, all right? If you were to take DCS code 047 inverted, that's the same as 023. If you take DCS code 025 and you were to take DCS code 244 and invert it, it's going to be the same code on there. So that's how the thing goes. And it's like that in that table on there. Now, the reason I bring that up is because when you're talking normal and inverted codes, you don't actually have, some people say, oh no, there's 208 DCS codes. No, there's not. There's actually only 104, but you have the inversion process on there. Now, what is the inversion process aspect of it? Well, the inversion process on there is basically dealing with how the DCS code is injected into the receiver. So when DCS or Dpl tones first came out, you didn't have the agile frequency receivers and abilities that we have today, by hands down. And what would sometimes happen is you would have local oscillators running at the IF frequency. So what people were finding out was like, whoa, wait a minute here. If we have the local oscillator running at the IF frequency above the frequency, above the receive frequency, then that was going to be a high injection of the way that receiver is. But if you have a local oscillator running at the IF frequency below the receive frequency, that was going to be a low injection. So what they started to find out is that local oscillators that were high injection, or receivers that were high injection, hey, no problem whatsoever. You could easily go ahead and take any of the normal tones and would go into it fine. But what they started to find out was with low injection local oscillators, you were finding out that, man, these normal tones were having a very difficult time opening up that receiver. Because if you think about it, it's kind of sort of like, and I'll use this analogy. Let's say you have a basket at about 3 feet off the ground. If I was to take a ball, all right, a bouncy ball, and I was to go and stand above that basket and drop it in, that would be like me using a normal tone going in high oscillation. I'm coming from the high area. Now, let's say I have that same bucket, and now I have that same ball, but now the bucket is, let's say it's turned upside down. All righty? Now, I know you're saying, well, John, a ball won't stay in a bucket upside down, but just go with me on this example. So instead of standing above the bucket and dropping it in there, where the ball's not going to go in there because the bucket's upside down, I could take and bounce this ball off the ground, and then it will hopefully bounce off the ground and up into the bucket. That would be a low injection. So what was happening is they found out, man, we need to do low injections. But if they were to say the terms DPL high, DPL low, that really didn't make a lot of sense, especially thinking and considering that, well, basically, whether you're going high or low, it's going to be a different numeral value, but they basically are both acting the same. It's just which, is it going in high or is it going in low? They decided to call it normal or inverted. Because if you really think about it, dropping the ball from the top, that's normal. But if we were to tilt our camera upside down, then that would be inverted, right? So that's where it kind of came out into there. So that's where that normal inverted happens. That's where there's a listing of, hey, it's normal, it's this code, but inverted, it's this code on there. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind if you ever see that on there. Now, I will tell you this. Here's the funny part. Let's talk about scanners and DPL codes real quick. Most scanners, unless they specifically say that they can see that it's inverted, which I don't know if any scanner can. If someone knows of a scanner that you could select DPL inverted or normal, definitely hit me in the comments here and stuff. But basically what's going to happen here is that you're going to have a situation where the scanner is always going to show you the normal tone. All right. So going back to that frequency, like I just said, that reference table on there, if someone is using 244 inverted, they actually may show up in the scanner as Dpl 025. Now, this is where the other funny part is, the whole deal, is that guess what? If you program your radio Dpl 025, but the repeater, what you're accessing is actually 244 inverted, with today's receivers and technology, you're going to stand a very, very, very strong chance that they may actually be able to communicate with one another. Okay? So just interesting part of Dcs Tones. So I kind of beat that one to death. Let's move on to Dtmf. So Dtmf, dual tone multi-frequency. So this was a technology adopted by the telecommunication systems, Mom, Pa, Bell, if we can go ahead and say it there. It was made by the Bell Systems in the U.S., and it was actually trademarked as touch tone for usage in phones starting all the way back in 1963. What they started to find out is that they wanted to have some sort of signaling method, or they wanted to have something that they could use that would not need operators anymore. Because you used to have operators. You used to, it's like you pick up the phone and then the operator will be like, "Hi, can I help you? Yeah, could I have, can I have Chicago 447?" And then they're like, "Yeah, stand by." And then this lady would take the cord and they, the old switchboards, the old, what was her name? Tom's, I can't think of the actress. She used to do that little thing on there that she used to be the operator on there. But what happened is that Dtmf Tones really kind of eliminated the operators on there. And what happened is that they basically went and had it set up now that a user could go and send a combination of tones, and those combinations of tones could then hit a filtering system, for sake of a better term, on the telephone system, and then that would filter it out. And that started to lead into these precursors of like the area codes and the prefixes and everything like that, where people could just basically take and dial a number, and then when it would go down that the telephone system. Now, mind you, I'm doing the 10,000 foot view. So if anybody's like a telco operator or understand, wires and rings and how systems work, understand we're not getting that granular. We're kind of just talking about a top side here. But what would happen is we'd go into that filter. So you'd pick up your phone, you'd go down the line, and let's say you dial the area code of 612. Okay, so I want to call Minneapolis 612. The minute that I send 612 down the line, it would go there and it would hear the filtering would be listening for the Dtmf combination of the number 6, the number 1, and the number 2. Then what it could do, it could take and it could split off that signal. Now it's in the 612 land, okay? Now when I enter that next set on there, so maybe 221, okay? So I enter 221, and then boom, it would then filter down to the phones that would have 221 because it was listening. Now it was hearing the combos for 2, the combo for 2, the combo for 1. And then finally, whatever the remaining 4 digits would be, then it would route it to that individual person on there. Looking at the codes and the tones that we have here, you can see that dual tone, Dtmf, dual tone multi-frequency, is truly that, dual tone on there. And what you see, for example, number 1, it is the tone of 697, and then it is a combination of tone 1209. So when you're pushing 1, your phone is simultaneously generating, or your keypad, I should say these days, because it's not just on phones anymore, is simultaneously generating a 697 hertz tone and a 1209 hertz tone. If I was going to do number 9, let's say, pushing the number 9 generates an 852 hertz tone and a 1477 hertz tone. And yes, it is generating them at the same time on there. So that's where the dual tone combination came in. Now, one of the interesting things about Dtmf is that Dtmf was used, like I said, in the Bell system on there, but really they started to see that, wait a minute, we can inject tones, easily generate tones, as you can see, by just pushing this button and it sets off those 2 tones together. We can incorporate that into an audio path of a communication system, i.e. your telephone lines. But then people started to say, why can't we use this for radio purposes and other things like that. And that's where the Dtmf functionality came in and was starting to include and is included on your radios on there to be able to send these two tones when the number keypad is pressed. As you see, this chart here also does incorporate the A, B, C, and D tones on there. So a lot of people will say, hey, wait, where did this and this and this and this? No, when it was actually introduced and produced, they easily were able to add that tone, that expandability on there to have A, B, C, and D. Now, of course, because they didn't have any sort of the initial keypads that were out there, didn't have A, B, C, and D, they lots of times it would be eliminated. Now, is that difficult? Is that problematic? No, it's just one row and the telephone doesn't generate those tones. So you'll see telephones still to this day only have the numbers of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, star, and pound. But when you look on like radio keypads, or if you're programming the ability to send tones and stuff on there, they'll have you allowed to put the A, B, C, and D in there for that. So that is Dtmf tones on there. Really simple, really easy about tones. And it's just so amazing how it can do. Now, as things have progressed, we've moved away from these tone filters that are in the phone system. We've used to DSP, digital signal processing, all these kind of things like that. Dtmf tones are very easy to decode on there. And you can even buy numerous sorts of relays out there, or devices that just by entering a certain key combination, you can activate a relay, activate an auto patch, do all these different things that are out there. Dtmf is very heavily used. As a matter of fact, high-speed Dtmf is actually used in cases of tornado siren or emergency alerting activation systems. So there's actually some agencies in the U.S., I believe it's Federal Signal makes a lot of those devices on there. They have the ability that they can send high-speed Dtmf. And high-speed Dtmf is basically sending Dtmf tones at specific timing with a specific rate with specific gaps in there. And these will then cause activation. They're usually much more faster than you can dial or anything like that on there, but it does do alerting and signaling for numerous different things on there. In my radio career, I've seen high-speed Dtmf activate everything from sirens, alert systems, to actually even doing tone remote systems, where you have a base radio somewhere and you have a bunch of devices that look like telephones spread out, so you're not right next to the radio. You pick it up, and when you key up the radio, it would go like that real quick, and that would then tell the interface to the radio, oh, I got to key up on this frequency or this channel on there. So Dtmf is used very heavily on many different things on there. All right, so let's now start to kind of move into a little bit more of what we want to say, more generalized signaling on there. And what I mean by this is the first one I'm going to touch on is MDC 1200 signaling. Now, these are the types of signaling that you're going to find in public safety radios. You're going to find it really brand specific. So MDC stands for Motorola Data Communications. And this is a signaling format that Motorola came up with using 1200 baud audio speed using audio frequency shift keying, also known as AFSK. And it uses tones at 1200 hertz and 1800 hertz to give the ones and the zeros. So what's going to happen is when you key your radio, you can do pre or post, so before the transmission or after the transmission, MDC 1200 data bursts. And that data burst has a lot of abilities and information in there. So MDC 1200 allows for unit ID. So you have 4 digits hexadecimal that you can use on there to do an ID. So for an example, my badge number is 5639, or 5638. So if I wanted to do 5638, have my radio ID 5638, I can enter that code into the radio to ID 5638. My partner, 5639, they can have their radio ID 5639, and it's individual bases of the radio only. Now, it doesn't use Dtmf or anything, and you're basically going to hear a squawk across the radio. It's going to be a like that, and it's going to be a quick squawk. It's sometimes referred to as a DOS squawk. Okay, so data operated signaling, and that data burst can contain your ID. It can contain a brief data message. So MDC 1200 allows users to be able to program their radios if they have that functionality on there to say we're on scene, we're going en route, whatever, just by hitting the push of a button. It has emergency signaling, so public safety radios. So like for an example, these radios here, when you have this orange button on the top here, I could push the orange button, and if it's set up for MDC 1200, it will send out a data bit that says emergency, and it will also send out my MDC 1200 ID. And then I can make other radios beep and show my ID that there's an emergency. It also allows for other things like a radio check. So when it's on there, dispatch could send, or if it's not necessarily dispatch, I know businesses use it, their dispatcher could send out and hit a button and that sends out a data burst to ping the radio, and the radio can act back to them. I can radio call them, so it can make the radio go beep, 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 or it can go ahead and even to the point of even doing what they call remote monitoring. Which I'll tell you what, if your dispatch has to remote monitor you, you got some problems, because during remote monitoring, MDC allows you to set it up that they could send the MDC function to remote monitor. The user's radio will actually key up without them interfering with it, and then the radio will stay keyed for X amount of time, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever the case may be on there. Now, that's pretty cool in that regards. If you send out an emergency signal, you hit that orange button, boom, sends out an emergency signal, then dispatch can turn around, act it, and acknowledge it, meaning so it stop beeping on their console or on their radios, and then they can go ahead and hit that remote monitor and hear what you're saying or hear what's going on. And then finally, which is a very, very nice feature for business and public safety and everything, is you can inhibit the radio. This is so important to me, which is that radio inhibit. If you have a radio that goes missing or something, or you don't know what happens to it, if you don't have, let's say, MDC 1200 for radio inhibit, or you're not using a digital voice format that can do radio inhibiting, guess what? That radio's gone. That radio's stolen, it's going to be gone. Someone could try to crack the password. They may be able to crack the password, but if your radio's missing, dispatch can go in, send the radio inhibit command. Upon sending that radio inhibit command, guess what happens? The radio goes dead. It's still powered on, but the radio goes dead. You can't transmit, you can't receive, you can't do nothing. And if you've ever seen a radio being inhibited, you'll know it's kind of an interesting thing. You'll turn the radio on. It will look like it's powering on, but the screen goes blank right away and goes dead. Almost like it's completely dead. You'll see sometimes some radios will go beep, and it like boom, it's like the display's dead and everything, like the battery's bad. Okay. The reason I would guess that it operates like that is because then someone's going to think, oh, the radio's dead, whatever, turn it in. Hey, I got the stupid radio, really they stole it. And, this and this and this and this. The nice thing about radio inhibit is that you can actually uninhibit the radio on there. So you can send a code to reinitialize or wake the radio back up for usage. And back in my public safety days, I had to do that a few times with a few radios. Some people had, quote unquote, the radios go missing. Okay, how long has the radio been missing? Oh, it's been missing a couple days. Okay, we need to send the inhibit command. Send the inhibit command, boom. We found out the radio was inhibited. Magically, the radio turns back up at the fire department. And then we take it, validate the radio, make sure it's still working, everything like that, and uninhibit it, the radio comes back to life. So that's the nice part about it. Now, one other thing that the MDC 1200 can do or use in it is it actually can be used for some systems for network or system access, meaning you have to send an MDC code or have it set up an MDC sequence that when you key your radio, only those radios that have those IDs for the MDC 1200 would be allowed in the system. So let's say I have ID 1234, or better yet, let's use it. So let's say I want to access my public safety system. I have a radio, my ID is 5638. I key up my radio, 5638 goes there. Let's say someone who doesn't have an MDC radio goes ahead and programs their radio and stuff like that, and then they try keying up the radio, and they're not keying up the system. Guess why? The system is locked down to having the proper MDC code. So let's say they go, oh, I hear MDC codes. Well, let me enter 1234. And they enter 1234 or 1111 or 00, whatever the case may be. They enter that code in. They try keying up. If that code isn't entered into the system, it's still going to ignore it, even though it's an MDC 1200 ID. So that's MDC 1200. Now, the next two I'm going to talk about are not per se as popular. The one used to be very popular before. The other one is still kind of used, but I hear it a lot being used by business, not so much as public safety. So the first one we're going to talk about is G star, GE star, sometimes referred to, like I said, as G star. Very, very, very similar to MDC 1200 in design and purpose. However, it was made by GE, hence why they called it G star. But G star used digital phase shift keying. So they went with digital phase shift keying, where MDC 1200 was audio frequency shift keying. And this thing with G star, if you were to ever listen to it, and Wisconsin State Patrol used to use G star a lot on their analog system before they went to the P25 digital trunk, and it would be like a kind of noise on there because it was that digital phase shift keying. So it was like a digital data burst on there, and that would have the same functionality and features that really MDC 1200 had, which was ID, emergency button, those kind of features and stuff on there. However, once again, it was made by GE, not Motorola. You had a GE system, you had this kind of feature set on there. So that's how the G Star system actually worked on there. Now, interesting, it was kind of interesting, the sound to it, where MDC 1200 is kind of like a kind of there. G Star was like a like almost like it was like a stuttering kind of data noise on there. Really now with everybody going digital, or a lot of the systems that GE got bought up by Tyco, Maycom, and I think they're Harris now or whatever. G Star has pretty much gone away. I don't think really anybody's using it. Radios can still sort of be purchased with the G Star signaling on there. And I'll be honest with you, last time I heard G Star signaling being used, I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago. And it was actually at a ham fest, and some guys just went along and they wanted to program G Star into their radios just to hear that funny little like that. Or they actually used it as like an overtone on simplex, like a Roger beep on there. Of course, G Star was not compatible with MDC 1200. So the final one, I guess I'm going to talk about kind of the business-wise sort of thing here, is Fleet Sync. So Fleet Sync is made by Kenwood. It uses 1200 baud, fast frequency shift keying, so FFSK, operates at 1200 or 2400 baud, and offers basic or enhanced encryption. Really, what's the difference? Well, there's really no difference whatsoever. It was just Kenwood's kind of version of data signaling that was put into radios on there. So the 80 series of radios. So if you had like a 780, an 880, I don't know if they made a 680. Maybe they made a 680 on there, but it was kind of being put in there. The 280s, the 380s, the 480s, all those kind of things. Kenwood was including it on there. And it was once again kind of a means to signal one another, to see IDs, to see all that kind of interesting stuff on there. They had Fleet Sync in kind of two interesting variables. Like I said, they had basic and they had enhanced. Basic would do basic ID, radio kill, radio alert, all those kind of things like MDC 1200 would do. But then enhanced allowed you to do text messaging with either 60 or 120 characters, I think it was. And then they would also allow you to do AVL and GPS mapping. So what can happen is that when you had Fleet Sync enabled and you were using the enhanced version, they could include the data packets, or actually the GPS coordination in the data packets, and then send it out. And that would be part of that Fleet Sync transmission. Hence why they called it Fleet Sync also, too. This is that you had your fleet of radios and you can synchronize between all of them with like GPS, AVL, automatic vehicle locating, or IDs, messaging, that kind of thing like that. You could easily send a message out to everybody with the Fleet Sync, to say, hey, return to shop, please, or you can individually alert a radio on there. Now, I threw in one more type of digital signaling. This is definitely a defunct signaling. However, and I don't know if they still are, if anybody's watching and they're in LA or stuff like that, let me know if LAPD still uses it. It's called MODAT. And it was basically stood for Motorola Data. And it was Motorola-based ID system. Once again, now obsolete. LAPD really subscribed to it. And it was sort of like 5/6 tone paging. Motorola has a big history of taking something and putting a little spin on it and then rebranding it underneath them. And that's what I would kind of equate MODAT to being. It uses a series of quick tones, numbering and stuff like that for the signaling, for your unit IDs, for all those kind of things like that on there. And if you listen to it over the air, you heard the tones. You heard like that. And that sequence of tones and the timing and everything like that would notify the other people there, the stuff on there. So Modat's not used really anymore. Modat was even before MDC 1200, if I remember correctly, on there. So it's really, really, really an older signal. Like I said, LAPD was notorious for that. They had it on all their radios. They had it on Sabres. As a matter of fact, I believe, and you're really digging in my memory here, that you used to have to order the LAPD package or feature set on your radios, like your Motorola Sabres or whatever, in order to have Modat signaling. You could not just get Modat. You couldn't just call Motorola and saying, "Hi, how you doing? I'm the little small town PD here in Wisconsin. I want to order 5 Motorola radios and I want Modat signaling." I believe they said you couldn't do that. So that's Modat signaling on there. So let's dig now into paging, tone paging in particular. Tone paging is really kind of interesting because it has gone through a lot of revisions and a lot of cycles and gone through a lot of different formats that are out there. Tone signaling has ranged everywhere from what we know today as Motorola Quick Call 2, which is very standardized tone signaling that is used for the activation of fire departments and stuff. My pager. I have a pager, and when a certain tone sequence or combination is sent from dispatch, it makes the pager wake up, it alerts it, and then I hear the message from dispatch on there. But tone signaling in general, at that 10,000 foot view, has different formats. So they have burst tones, they have Motorola Quick Call 1 and Quick Call 2 series, they have reach tones, they have plectron tones, they have AvCall, they have GE Type 99, they have NEC, and then there is 5/6 tone paging on there. What is really the difference? Well, the difference is the way the tones are sent out, and then the final way and difference is basically, is it the tones are standard or are they not standard on there? So burst tone, real quick, very simple. A tone is sent out over the air for X amount of seconds. Now, some of these timings can be milliseconds, and some of these timings could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, how many actual full seconds. And it all depends on the manufacturer there. There was no set standard. The reason they came out with so many different tone signalings is because they weren't all designed for pagers. Some were only designed for pagers. Some were only designed as a radio signaling method from a base to a mobile. And then some were used across the board where you can say, hey, a person could carry their pager as well as have this tone set in their radios, in their mobiles, and then they would actually hook it up to car horns or something like that on there. So burst tone was a burst tone on there. There was a couple different formats based on there of like how long the tone was. Once again, 100% specific. I can't say it. 100% specific to the need or the application. Motorola Quick Call 1 and Quick Call 2 were very similar, but the timings were different. And I'll get over to timings in a minute. We're going to talk about Motorola Quick Call 2 tonight, though, because that is the most common one on there. Reach, Plectron, AvCall, GE Type 99, and NEC, they all had different timings. And the basic concept with all the ones that I just did, with the exception of a burst, is you have an A tone and you have a B tone. Now, what makes each one individually different as per manufacturer is the toning. How long is that A tone sent over the air? How long is that B tone sent over the air? And how long is the gap between the A tone and the B tone? Some formats have an A tone, no gap, B tone. Some have an A tone, a gap, and then a B tone. Then some have an A tone for X amount of seconds, and then a gap or no gap, and then a B tone for X amount of seconds. And the different formats vary. You could have a tone longer than a B tone, or you could have a B tone longer than an A tone, or you can have the B and the A, or the A and the B the same as there, or you could have only a single tone. So you basically don't have a B tone, you have just one long A tone. And that's where Quick Call 2 kind of comes in there. Once again, very specific. NEC and GE Type 99, they're kind of gone. They're kind of out there. I know some places still use plectron tones out there. I think some do some signaling, I know, but I'm not 100% sure. Reach has kind of gone by. AvCall, I think AvCall still uses a little bit. I believe that's for the aviation call systems. Motorola Quick Call 1 system is gone, but Quick Call 2 is really what's there. And let's take a look at the timing for Quick Call 2 here. So With Motorola, they called it a 1-in-1 or quick call 2 series. Now, what this means is you have a couple different formats and versions of how things worked. So with these tone formats, you had the ability to have a pager that could either just alert via tone, or you could have a pager that could alert with tone and voice. Then they came out with options that could be vibrate and voice, or tone and vibrate and voice. So it would beep and then it would vibrate as well as you would hear the voice. And then you could have individual calls or you could have group calls. So if we actually take a look at the base tone on there, you're going to see tone only, battery save, and then tone only. So what that did is that people used to carry around a pager. And I'll tell you this, have you ever seen the movie Caddyshack? If you see the movie Caddyshack and Dr. Beeper on there, okay, Dr. Beeper, his one that would go beep, 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 and he had to go find a phone. Those were tone only pagers. All right. The two tone, if you were to actually listen to the frequency over the air, you would hear the tone sequence coming at it. So it'd be the tone only was 0.4 seconds and then 0.8 seconds. So really it was like a dee-doot, or actually it's like a dee-doot, like that. Just, I can't even do it because it's like that's how quick it was. So short. It wasn't even a full second. And what that would do is that would basically make the pager goes beep, 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 beep. And it didn't care. And the reason it didn't care was because guess what? It was so short. And you're not need to do a long alert. When the pager would receive the tone, it would alert for X amount of seconds. And then the person knew to call into their office or call into the answering service. Well, as time developed and time went on, they needed to start to do more on it. And then they wanted to move to battery saver. So battery saver tone, if you noticed that if your pager, because these things ran on battery, the pagers ran on battery, that if they weren't used for a while, didn't hear traffic, they would go almost into sleep mode. So what would happen is the tone only, they would send that tone for almost 3 seconds. So sort of like a dee, dee. That's basically 2.7 seconds and then the 0.8 seconds. You know, like I said, can't even really do it that well either. But what would happen is then the pager would wake up when it'd hear the long tone saying, oh, wait a minute. Hey, I need to wake up. I'm hearing it for it. Okay, hey, I don't hear 0.4 seconds of the tone that I need to. Okay, I'm going to ignore it. So now they said, okay, that's great. So tone and voice paging came along. And when tone and voice paging came along, what happened is that they said, wait a minute, we need to now do a couple things. We need to alert the pager. We need to make it beep. And now we need to put a speaker in there so that the message can go ahead and be played. Well, what happened is that you only had X amount of tones and codes you could do because the receiver, you couldn't really alert with subaudible tones. You had to have audible tones. And that's why paging tones run pretty much anywhere from about the low 300 hertz almost up to 3000 hertz. All right, so that whole the spectrum right there. And what they did is Motorola came up with a format here and said, you know what, I'm going to do two kinds of voice alerting. We're going to do group call and we're going to do individual tone and voice paging. So what Motorola had happen, and you hear this sometimes a lot if you have a pager, the group call is that long tone. So it's like a doo for 8 seconds, and then your pager, back in the old days, would go beep to let you know that, hey, it'd be like a long, constant, steady tone. Well, that's changed now with the way the pagers are. And then individual tones would be an A tone for 1 second, and then a B tone for 3 seconds. So what happened in that case is that you would hear the dee-doo, for sake of a better term. I'm sorry I don't have any audio set up for this on there and stuff. You can, once again, find all these examples online. But then that would make the pager go beep, 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 and then you knew that it was an individual call. So the concept with this kind of format of signaling was to have it set up that, hey, you send out one long tone and it could alert like a department that might have 4 or 5 different stations or ambulance or something. So you can alert everybody at once. And then the individual calls could be an actual individual person, an actual individual unit, or maybe an individual station. So that's where they came up with the tone signaling. But as I said here, with this type of signaling, you had to have 2 tones. And the 2 tones would have to be X amount of seconds. And then in this case, looking at the screen there, let's use individual call tone and voice. You have the tone for 1 second, and then right away after the first tone ends, that second audible tone is there for 3 seconds, and then it makes your pager alert on there. So that's actually a form of signaling because this has actually been used for operations of different things. So like siren activation, of course, obviously activation of fire and EMS, and even some law enforcement places. I know in public works departments, back in the day, they did not even have two-way radios, as in like handheld radios. They only had them mobile radios. So what they would do is they would have each individual truck numbered, and then their dispatch could hit a button and it could page that truck, and then their horn would start beeping, so they know, hey, I got to go back and I got to call dispatch for some reason or something on there. So that's a form of signaling, and it is actually a valid form of signaling, which a lot of people don't realize. Everybody always takes it as in like, oh, this is nothing more than just some public safety type thing on there. In all reality, it's not. It really has been used by different things. As a matter of fact, when pagers were all the rage, so we're talking like the late 80s, early 90s, that kind of thing like that, a lot of people, and I was one of them, in northern Wisconsin, we didn't have numeric and alphanumeric pagers right away. We had voice pagers. And the reason being was, okay, numeric pagers, that's fine. You can enter the telephone number. But when alphanumeric pagers were starting to come about, people were saying, wait a minute, I have to have a call service. I have to have something. When someone's sitting at a terminal, they're going to enter the message, and when I get it, I can look at my pager and say, aha, here's the text message. It's not like today where people who still have pagers, or as pagers were slowly dying off, you could actually send an email to them or whatever. We didn't have that back then. So what you did was you had the voice pager, and then the voice pager would go off, and then it would be the other person on the line. So you'd hear, person would pick up the phone, it's like they would say, like, please leave a message after the tone for the customer. And then I'd be like, hi, this is John. Can you go ahead and please give me a telephone call? Thank you very much. Bye. Click. The person on the other end, their pager would be, hi, this is John. Can you please give me a call when you have a chance? Thanks. Okay. And then you would actually hear that. So that was actually a form of signaling that was used very, very much. As a matter of fact, I remember I had a GP300, and I actually had it set up that I could listen for my voice paging for personal usage on that radio. I could turn it to a channel. It could sit there. So I could carry around my radio, but then also what I could do is I could actually have it so that if someone needed to get a hold of me, I wouldn't have to carry my fire EMS pager, my radio, as well as my personal pager. I can condense it all down into actually one on there. Now, the final signaling type we're going to talk about is 5/6 tone signaling. Now, let me back up to one more thing. The reason I brought up also two-tone, or quick call 2, sometimes it was referred to as, or two-tone paging, and 5/6 tone paging, is because depending on the radios that you can buy today, whether it be some that are part 90 but are sold for amateur usage, definitely business, definitely LMR kind of things, and definitely public safety, have some of these feature sets in there. Some of the pagers you can also buy. I know people who buy, like, for example, the Unication pagers as receivers. They have 5/6 tone signaling on there, so that's why we're bringing some of this up. Now, 5/6 tone signaling is common in European countries. They use it a lot. What happens with the 5/6 tone paging is literally it is 5 tones or a 6-tone combination, depending on individual or group. And then the tones, there's a number. So you have basically 0 through 9. And for the 5 tones, you could have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for argument's sake. And each number would represent a tone. Now, the EIA had a standard set of tones that were to be used based on the different formats of 5/6 tone. So it kind of kept it nice and controlled as saying, okay, I'm going to use 5/6 tone paging. I'm going to use the ZEVI format or set of tones. Then what you could do is you would know that, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you look on that list, once again, where I got before was in that book, and I would know which tone it is there. Now, the way 5/6 tone paging would work is it was sent in within 33 milliseconds, and what you would hear is you would hear the first tone for a little bit longer than the other tones on there. So it'd be like, real quick, and then your pager would hear that. So that first tone was sort of like a wake-up tone, and that other tone was kind of that, like, hey, it's individually addressed to you. Then your pager would go dee, and then you could send the voice message on there. Now, the reason they call it 5/6 tones is because if it was a group call, what they would do is they would add on a 6th tone, and the 6th tone would then signify the group in that series. So sort of like how Motorola did to a degree with that long tone for notifying the whole group, or the 1 second, 3 second tone, the 2 tones for the individual. 5/6 tone sort of did that, but instead of doing timing, they just added a digit for the group tone on there. So that's how 5/6 tones worked on there. 5/6 tone paging is really cool if you have it set up and you use it as a signaling method between individuals. In the US, once again, 5/6 tone is not really used. Very big over in Europe. As a matter of fact, Motorola actually made 5/6 tone pagers, which are really big over in Europe. And then the GP300s and I think maybe a few other radios had 5/6 tone paging in it. So instead of having quick call 2 paging in it for a US version or a North America version, in the UK version or European version of the radio, they actually had 5/6 tone paging. Now, in addition to that, 5/6 tone paging also is so short in the duration as sent. Some people will use that in place of, let's say, MDC 1200 or Dtmf paging in their radios. They'll actually use 5/6 tone paging, and it really works well because you can have an individual code or you can have a group code which would activate everybody's pager. Alrighty. Wow, lots to talk about signaling, right? But I've been going on here for a while and stuff. Thank you for staying with me. I hope you're getting some education on it. But now it comes to that time for our new part of our show that we started last week. You know what really bends my antenna? You know what really bends my antenna? Is with all the different varieties that are out there in this day and age for tone signaling and the ability to have tone signaling, is why is there so many different ones, or even more of the popular ones are not standard on a lot of radios? And I give you a good case in point as an example here, is that you will tend to find on North America radios in the business or the LMR, usually we'll stick to things such as like 2-tone paging or PL and DPL. They might have Dtmf paging. Okay, that's fine. But why not include, or why not come to a standard format of signaling? And a good case in point is MDC 1200 signaling. That is sort of becoming now standard. You can now find MDC 1200 as either an option or a standard of radios that are not Motorola made. So for an example, some of the Kenwood series, the NX5000 series, or some of the other older Kenwood models had MDC 1200 as a built-in option or a inexpensive option that you could add to the radio in order to be compliant or communicate or signal the same with other Motorola radios on there. But even still, looking at radios that are even used, let's say in the amateur world on there, if you buy a radio that is amateur radio capable, but might be Part 90 certified, you are going to get the luxury of having maybe 2-tone activity or 2-tone page and receive, 5/6 tone page and receive also, maybe even a few more different types of signaling on there. Why is it that we really haven't expanded the use of 2-tone paging? I know personally from my experience in my systems, I actually have some backup systems and kind of, how do you want to say, safety switches built into my system that can only be activated with a 2-tone sequence combination. Why would I do that, may you ask? Well, I do that for one specific reason. If my repeater is being hacked or there's something going on, I want to be able to have a very unique system that would allow me to be able to do the system. So for an example on mine, I could send a 2-tone code, which would allow my repeater to shut down. But I'm always caught at a crossroads, because if something is going on with my repeater, I need to make sure I have a business radio or some radio that can actually send a 2-tone combination over the air in order to activate or deactivate that feature or functionality. In the amateur world, I can easily see how 2-tone or 5/6 tone or MDC 1200 can be used. On GMRS, I hear people using MDC 1200 signaling and tones on there. Moving into LMR and business, a lot of people are starting to take advantage of these additional activation or signaling features. Why? For multiple reasons, like we told about the features of what's in there. Unit identification, the ability to inhibit radios, the ability to do this, and multiple things, send messages and everything on there. The issue really comes in, which really bends my antenna, is that we don't really seem to have a standardized aspect of things. Now, with the exception of maybe MDC 1200, which is not really the case because a lot of places are now coming up with a version very compatible with it. For an example, Hytera, I believe, has HDC 1200. But what you could do is have these different variations that could cross-communicate with one another. Signaling is very nice to have. And if you're in digital, you don't really need to worry about it because digital voice formats have that ability or functionality of private calls or individual calls or something built into that. It's for us, the analog users, that want to be able to have a more specific way, that want to only be able to have to monitor a radio or a frequency when their tone is active, are really limited. Ctcss tone is not very individual based. Dpl or Dcs tone is not really individual based. Dtmf is somewhat, but once again, the aspects of it being in a controlled or easily set up fashion might be a little more difficult. And that, not having that kind of ability to go across multiple platforms with generalized signaling is what this week's bending my antenna. So, thank you everybody for tuning into this week's episode of Communications Cigars. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it provided some information for you. Once again, if you have any questions or anything like that, please feel free to email me. My email address is up there. I'm more than willing to. We got some great ideas that have come in already for shows that we're going to be doing through December here, as well as already starting in next year. So we look forward to seeing it then. Until then, 73, stay safe and enjoy your cigars if you have them.